Again, thank you everybody today for joining us. We're really excited to have Jon Oltsik joining us today. There's definitely there's a shift in endpoint security as we're seeing it certainly here at Morphisec, Jon. And I think that some of the data that you've researched and some of the data that you published on sort of like what that next innovation is looking like in endpoint security is really fascinating. I think that we are at a little bit of a shift and a crossroads in this market where you've got some vendors looking at trying to extend beyond the endpoint, trying to focus on some really critical components, which are encompassing of threat hunting and monitoring and really using things like behavioral analysis and AI and machine learning to get better on the back end for things that can't be prevented in most environments. And I think that this is an interesting conversation for sure that you and I have had back and forth around prevention, right? And what does that mean? For everybody today, Jon's got a presentation for us around advanced prevention. He's defining what that is relative to what that means to this market, where the innovation's happening, and he's going to present some data, certainly that ESG has researched around this topic. On the back end, I'll be following on with a little more granularity around a new approach that Morphisec is taking that maps directly into advanced prevention, which is encompassing of our approach to the market, which is moving target defense. I'll present some use cases around the technology, and I'll present some information around some of the threats that we've dug into, that we've prevented customers against. Kind of contrast that with a few other things that are happening in the market. So really excited to get going here. Jon, I will turn it over to you, and I'll push your slides. So just let me know. Give me a next when you're ready to get to the next slide.
Thanks, Tom, and hello to everyone listening in. So I'm Jon Oltsik, Senior Principal Analyst and ESG Fellow, and I'm going to talk about advanced prevention for endpoint security. And Tom, you mentioned this a little bit, but it wasn't too long ago that you thought of endpoint security and it was synonymous with antivirus technology. And that really hasn't been the case over the past few years. We've seen next generation endpoint security. We've seen a lot of innovation. And so therefore, there's an opportunity to talk about what's the best case, what's the best practices for endpoint security, and we'll talk a little bit about that today. So if you go on to my next slide, I'm going to look at endpoint security in the context of the current state of cybersecurity operations. And I think that's important because security operations is sort of an overlying task. It's all about not only preventing threats, but detecting and responding to threats as well. And we have to look at endpoint security, like I said, in that context. There are changes in progress, and I'll talk about what's going on, where the challenges are today, and some of the strategies that organizations are employing to address those challenges. Then I'll talk about advanced prevention for endpoint security, and I'll wait to define advanced prevention at that point because I think we've thought about prevention, detection, and response. We've thought about some next generation technologies, but advanced prevention is something new, and I'll talk about that. And then finally, the bigger truth is my summary and conclusion, and then I'll turn it back over to Tom. So if we go to the next slide, please. This is a level setting slide. So we recently surveyed over 350 cybersecurity professionals working at enterprise organizations. Enterprise being defined as organizations with 1,000 employees or more. And again, we wanted to level set. We said, what are your top security operations objectives? Now, there's a lot of data on the slide, but I've highlighted two. So 34% said that their organization wanted to improve their ability to detect, contain, and remediate advanced attacks and insider threats. Well, why would we want to improve those things? Because our behavior today, our performance today, isn't very good. So the Verizon DBIR report tells us that detection of events takes in excess of 200 days on average, at least for the incidents that they investigated in their report. And so it generally takes an adversary between minutes to hours to infiltrate or compromise a system. And then it takes us about 200 to 220 days to detect the event. And once the event is detected, then we're on to investigations, which take time. We're on to remediation and response activities, which take time and involve multiple organizations, such as IT operations. And then we have to coordinate things like ticketing systems and enumerating the attack and putting together a life cycle of actions and putting together workbooks or run books to get from attack detection through investigations through remediation. So anything we can do to accelerate that is tantamount, and thus it's the top security operations objectives. And then 29% said that they wanted to improve their ability to discover, prioritize, and remediate software vulnerabilities. Anyone who's worked at a large organization knows that there are thousands of vulnerabilities open at any one time. And they have different CVSS scores, and they have different associations to different types of assets. The value of these assets are classified. We don't know much about some of these vulnerabilities other than the fact that they're vulnerable, other than the fact that, like I said, we have a CVSS score. So somehow we have to prioritize which ones we want to address. We have to then work with, again, IT operations to patch those systems. We have to make sure they're patched. This is a process. Now, I've been in security for 15 years full-time, and it's something that was a problem when I started in security, and it's still a problem today. So there are other things on this slide, as I said, that I won't really talk about here, but we can share the data with people. But the question really is, how are we doing against these types of objectives? So Tom, if we go to the next slide. I tend to ask this question whenever I do research. So basically what I'm saying is, if you were to look at cybersecurity analytics and operations today versus 2 years ago, how would you characterize that? And you can see 72% of those we surveyed said that cybersecurity analytics and operations is either significantly more difficult today than it was 2 years ago, or it's somewhat more difficult today than it was 2 years ago. Now, I can't think of many professions where things get incrementally more difficult all the time, but cybersecurity is one of them. And when things get more difficult, we have to make changes. We have to understand what our challenges are and address those challenges. But in fact, with this slide, we have to ask ourselves, well, why are people saying that things are more difficult? And we did that. If you go into the next slide, of those 72% who said things were more difficult, here's why they said things are more difficult. So the top answer, 26%, said the threat landscape is evolving and changing so rapidly, making it difficult to keep up with trends we need to understand for security analytics and operations. Well, this makes sense for a couple of reasons. One is that malware has changed. So we don't have the mass malware, the worms and the viruses that we did 10 years ago. Instead, what we have are targeted malware systems where a lot of attacks are intended to attack one system or one user. And I was thinking about this as Tom kind of set this up, is when I started in security, we had hackers. We had people who would scan your network. They'd look for vulnerable systems. They knew networking. They knew operating system technology. They followed the security bulletins. And now what we have are opportunistic cyber criminals who exploit individual users, typically through phishing attacks, and typically either through email or through the web. So it's changed a lot, and the threat landscape is difficult to keep up with. Then down a little bit lower, I talk about the 18% who say we don't have the right skills to keep up with security analytics and operations. And the problem, or this problem, is more pronounced today than it was 2 years ago. If you're in security, you've written, or not written, you've read about the security skill shortage. It's a global phenomenon. ESG research indicates that 51% of organizations say that they have a problematic shortage of cybersecurity skills. In another research project we did with the ISSA, the Information Systems Security Association, 70% of respondents said that their organization has been impacted by the cybersecurity skill shortage. Typically, that means that there's an increased workload on each cybersecurity team member, that they can't find people, they can't hire people, they can't retain people, people are burning out. So it's not surprising that one of the reasons things are getting more difficult is that organizations just don't have the right skills to keep up. If we go to the next slide, some of the challenges we see. 25% say our security team spends too much time responding to alerts to investigate possible incidents, many of which are false positives. Now think about all of the endpoints in your organization, and think about all of the alerts that are generated through the tools that are looking at endpoint security. So there's too many alerts, there's too many tools, and as we just talked about, there aren't enough resources, there aren't enough people, and the people that we have may not have the right skills to keep up. Another operational challenge, and this is actually specific to endpoint security, but another operational challenge is 23% said we regularly re-image infected endpoint devices, creating work for our help desk and impeding end user productivity. What we see in large enterprises is that they typically are re-imaging dozens of systems each month. Rough and tough, it costs about $400 to re-image each system. It takes between 2 and 3 hours. And during that time, as is stated here, an end user is unproductive. An end user is offline, which is problematic for the end user, problematic for their manager, and certainly creates a workload for the IT and IT operations and security teams. And then 19% say there's a lack of integration and automation between our endpoint security tools, which requires a significant level of manual processes. It's not unusual for organizations to have anywhere between 3 and 5 endpoint security agents on a system, which means there are 3 to 5 endpoint security tools. Oftentimes those tools come from different vendors. So I may have, for instance, Symantec on thousands of PCs, and then McAfee on a few hundred scattered throughout my remote offices. Oftentimes those endpoint security tools are not at the latest rev. So I've got to manage different revisions. I have to know which revisions are where. I have to know when. Oftentimes that creates projects for upgrades. And that creates manual processes, as this states. And there are lots of other, again, there's lots of other things. Once again, skills comes into play, budgets come into play. So there are a lot of challenges there. And Tom, I'm curious, since you and Morphisec are out looking at the same types of customers that I am, does this data ring true to you? Does this data look like it represents the problems that you see out in the market?
John, I think it speaks to absolutely everything that we're seeing and more. And I think what really kind of rings true and resonates with Morphisec and the prospects we talk to, the partners we're starting to engage with and strike up partnerships with, customers both mid-market and enterprise. It's they all have the same issue here. And I think that one thing that they're really seeing is sort of a disconnectedness, not just between tools and platforms, but there's only so much monitoring that one can do, that one SOC analyst can do. There's only so much that that signature-based detection can do, right? Like there's this defined swath of targeted attacks that honestly, I think are becoming, and I think you probably pointed this a little bit later here, which are the most damaging to organizations when they don't see it coming and there's not indicators associated with anything that they can, with any of their detection engine, that their detection engines can leverage. And I think that the other thing too is we're seeing that CISOs and CIOs, because our tech has a lot of benefit to the CIO, John. CISOs and CIOs are looking for tools that are a lot simpler and aren't requiring a whole lot of ramp up time to not only just to get the tech, not only just to get the tools going, but to manage it in an ongoing way, right? Like, the questions they're asking are, does it fit into my workflow? And boy, it would be great if this technology didn't require me to go train a couple of people, because at the end of the day, to your point here, they don't have the people. They can't find the people and they can't retain those people. So the easier that that technology becomes to start to leverage for both detection and prevention, I think is really what today's operational folks are looking for, which is, don't give me another science project. Give me something that just works and show that it works, right? Back up your claims, to all the vendors out there, because to a certain extent, some of the claims today are starting to kind of also, like, they're all kind of starting to sound the same.
Yeah, I agree. And I think that, again, the research bears that out. If you go on to the next slide, I think we're doing away with polling questions today, so you can go ahead. So this is this year's 2018's cybersecurity spending. And a couple things you'll notice is that 63% of those we surveyed said that cybersecurity spending would increase in 2018. So that is a reflection of the problem we face, that we have to spend more. And we certainly don't expect any changes in 2019. We'll be fielding our 2019 spending intentions research survey fairly soon. But I wouldn't expect any change. In fact, I would expect this to either be flat or even go up. But let's talk about that. We spent more, or we're spending more in 2018. We should be spending more in 2019. That's my forecast. Well, what are we spending that money on? Well, we certainly would like to increase our cybersecurity staff, and that is one of the components of this budget. And certainly most organizations we talk to want to do that, but they're struggling. They can't find people. Oftentimes when they do hire people, they have to hire junior people because they can't find skilled people. They have to train them. So we have to assume, and this is something I tell CISOs, is assume that every decision that you make will be hindered by the fact that you won't have enough people to take that action. So what else are we doing? Well, we're probably spending money on projects and new types of technologies, and sometimes we're upgrading to the latest versions of technologies or even new innovative type of technologies. But once again, those require people. Those require people to deploy those solutions and get trained on those solutions and operate those solutions. If it's a big project, how many of those can we do? We've only got finite resources. We need to make sure that our projects are successful, that they support the business. So we have to really be selective on what we do there. And so more money is good, but we have to be smart about our money. We have to strive for a high return on investment, which means much greater efficacy for our security technologies and much lower overhead, operational overhead of our technologies. So moving forward, that's really what CISOs have to strive for, is that greater efficacy, streamlined operations. And that brings us to our topic of the day. If we go to the next slide, the need for advanced prevention. Now, a few years ago, we said, well, we can't possibly detect every type of security incident, security attack. So therefore, we should spend a lot more money on detection and response and maybe cut back on prevention. But once again, that assumes that we have the resources for detection and response. It assumes that the prevention technologies can't improve. And I don't believe that. I think, and that really speaks to this concept of advanced prevention. Advanced prevention technologies are designed using modern software. They're designed to take advantage of things like cloud computing. They're designed to take advantage of things like modern operating systems, multi-core processors, lots of memory, and use things like machine learning to do a much, much better job at detecting tactics, techniques, and procedures used by cyber adversaries. Now, the goal here is to shift the balance of power to defenders. What we want to do is decrease the attack surface, as is stated there, but we also want to use advanced prevention technologies to make our security infrastructure better. So we've invested all this money into security. Why can't we make that more effective? And that's really what we want to do by making it harder for the adversaries to penetrate our networks. So again, the thought here is high efficacy, low complexity, meaning we don't want advanced prevention to be a 3, 6 month, 12-month project. We want to be able to deploy technologies that have this effect. So if we go to the next slide, what are we talking about for endpoint security? Well, we want technologies that can block exploits and malware without prior knowledge. So if we think about traditional AV, AV was based on signatures. Signatures meant that we'd seen something, we'd investigated it, we determined it was malware. Typically that was a file. And then we took a signature, which was a file hash, and we said, if you see these file hashes, block them. But that was rear view mirror security. Very effective and also pretty efficient. The AV vendors are pretty good at providing signatures within a reasonable time frame, but it doesn't help us for new types of attacks. So we need advanced prevention to be able to block those exploits, block malware without prior knowledge. Now, if we can do that, it makes our AV that much more effective. It's sort of the force multiplier effect, where AV turned on, even with some advanced rules, supplemented by these advanced prevention techniques, will block the vast majority of exploits and malware attacks. Even fileless malware can be blocked in this way. And what we're after here are turnkey products. I mentioned we only have so many resources, we can only do so many projects. We need products that we can install that immediately increase our efficacy with no customization or tuning. And that's really where Morphisec fits in. So if you go to the next slide, once again, I think we're skipping the polling question. So current security strategies aren't working. They're really based on the history of security, where we saw a new type of threat, we installed or deployed some type of countermeasure to that threat, but we didn't look across our organization at risk. And we really didn't understand what adversaries were trying to do. If an adversary is trying to penetrate our network and willing to invest resources and time into that, we ought to understand what they're doing on a step-by-step basis, not just blocking random types of attacks or missing those attacks. Now, more is not better. I think the history here, Tom, is we've said more is better. There's a new type of threat. I'll add a new type of countermeasure, like I said, but they're diminishing returns, and we have to be much, much smarter about what we employ and how we deploy it. So CIOs need quick and easy wins. We need to decrease the attack surface, make it much, much harder for the adversaries to attack us. And in deploying advanced prevention for endpoints, like Morphisec, we're able to do that. And the goals here are to improve security efficacy and decrease operational overhead. Again, we want to deploy things that make our job easier, that take work away from us, but do a better job at detecting and blocking new types of attacks. So with that, thank you very much for listening. Tom, why don't you go and give us some specifics now on how Morphisec fits this advanced prevention model?
Sure, John, thank you very much. I think it's definitely one of the interesting points that you hit on here was more is not better. I can't even tell you how many times that we've heard that. It's like every conference that we go to, every customer and prospect who we talk to, it's always the same. We hear that constantly. And we've taken that very seriously, at least in terms of how we've, number one, architected our technology, and number two, how we're trying to solve, what should be a very straightforward challenge for customers. But unfortunately, because I would say that there's an element of confusion in the market. Not necessarily that people are confused per se, but there's almost too many choices to be able to kind of look at, well, this solution does X, this solution does Y. And I think that, the subscription to more being better, perhaps maybe 3 to 4 years ago, the notion was building a bigger stack. And the reality is, I think operators need to start looking at themselves in the mirror and thinking, maybe just if they could just change their thinking a little bit and think that, well, you know what, I just need to have the right stack, right? I don't necessarily just need to continually lump more layers in. Layers are good, right? It gives attackers more to think about and more to kind of figure out how to evade and how to get through. But it has to be the right layers, right? I think that's a very salient point. I think that's becoming a very critical component of cybersecurity. So, yeah, really, really good point. I wanted to hit on that. So why don't I jump in here, and I am going to just very quickly take a second to go to the next presentation here. And I am going to jump into immediately just a quick, slight overview of who Morphisec is and why we're qualified to have this conversation today. And John, please jump in anywhere where you see that there's a couple of areas where you can add some color. Basically, at Morphisec, we were founded in 2014, and our technology really comes out of research. Oftentimes, you hear about a lot of really cool cyber startups, many coming out of Israel today, that are all military backed, or at least the technology is born out of military. And we're actually kind of the opposite, which is pretty cool. The research comes out of Ben Gurion University Cyber Research Labs, with a number of different people who are currently operationally involved in the company and then affiliated with the company, who really looked at this concept of moving target defense and said, you know what, we're going to apply this to cybersecurity. And just the history of the company is really, really cool. Anyway, but for today, we've got 7 current patents out in the market for our tech. We launched our product, our commercial product, in May of 2016. So we are closing in on 2 years in market right now. We've surpassed 60 employees, both in Israel, Boston, and other locations throughout the world. And then we're venture backed. So, some of our investors are Jerusalem Venture Partners, GE Capital, Deutsche Telekom, Orange, just to name a few. And digging into the problem that we solve, John, I think this maps right directly into a lot of the case that you've already started to build up here for Morphisec, which is, computer systems historically have been static, right? And that's made them very, very easy to attack. And this maps directly right back into the more is not necessarily better mindset, which I think is starting to shift cybersecurity in a major, major way right now. just building more layers to create more obstacles, but keeping your resources and your assets and your business in the same location, eventually people are going to get through, right? And it just makes them very hard to defend. So this is fundamentally what this company is built on in terms of making targets more dynamic. And I'll get into that in just a minute here. I'd like to sort of, I think one thing that's going to be really helpful for the folks who have attended here for our webinar today, not just for today, but for the future. I think it's interesting to point out the differences between the status quo, which is basically the current stack for how much of the cyber world is approaching endpoint security, and then Morphisec, right? And the way I've broken this down for today is 4 factors: time, attack vectors, simplicity, and then ROI, right? And I want to throw this up here, not to say that AV and GAV and EDR isn't good or isn't necessary in the market. It's more to draw the comparison between how Morphisec is different from what the status quo currently is in the market based on these 4 factors. So I'll dig right into it. Number 1, if we look at time, the element of time is critical in any attack, whether it's a low-level attack or whether it's an attack that's staged out across multiple phases that's specifically targeting an organization with a lot of different techniques. And if you're looking at AG and NGAV, well, it requires a lot of discovery, and oftentimes, in your words, John, it's rear-view mirror security, right? It's after the fact. Something's already potentially executed. The difference between how Morphisec is architected and the rest of the endpoint security world is architected is that we're focused on being instantaneous and how we're able to prevent attacks that haven't been seen before early, often, and effortlessly. So that what that means is operators don't have to worry about it. It just prevents. It just works. And I have got some examples to support that's exactly how our technology is architected here. Number 2, attack vectors. If you're thinking about, just as an example, malware, right? Malware is not always part of every targeted attack, but it's an element of a lot of attacks. You're reliant solely upon AV and next-gen AV, and perhaps some monitoring technology out of the EDR camp. Well, they're not very good at being able to help prevent the execution of unknown attacks. Morphisec, we're architected specifically to do that, and oftentimes we serve as, and this is kind of an interesting use case, we serve as a virtual patch where there are multiple operating system updates often that have to be executed across thousands and often sometimes in some cases hundreds of thousands of endpoints. We serve as a virtual patch. You have to update the Morphisec agent so that it is compatible with the operating system patch, right? You can just run Morphisec during that patch gap. And what we've seen is it's a huge benefit, not only to security operators, but to the CIO's team as well, too. Many of our customers leverage that exact use case, both in on-premise endpoints in the cloud, and then virtualized systems like a VDI system from Citrix or from VMware, whatever the virtual system is. That's very critical. Number 3 is simplicity. As you mentioned already, John, a lot of the respondents of your survey had said, "Look, I've got a lot of alerts, right? And I sometimes it's hard to delineate what I really need to investigate in terms of the alerts that are fired." Oftentimes, this can be a time-consuming process, and if you're looking at technology specifically like an NGAV or an EDR, well, they tend to be a little bit complex and need more management than your average security tool. So Morphisec is totally focused on being able to disable that attack framework, right, with basically the capability to set and forget the technology. This gives operators much more value, much more quickly, without the management of a system that may either take A, a long time to deploy, or B, deployment plus management and training on that platform to be able to pour through some of those logs and to understand exactly how to leverage the intelligence that's coming out of those. Finally, ROI. Cost burden on the defender is substantial, right? With an escalation that doesn't really seem to stop in terms of there's always new endpoints. There's always new endpoints that need to be managed. Oftentimes, these are distributed platforms, right, in distributed environments across organizations that are global organizations. What that means is there's technology has to work, and it has to work seamlessly in a way that's real time, right? And oftentimes, this is not the case with the current status quo, or at least that's how we refer to it, right? And it shifts the costs. When we look at Morphisec and what we're trying to do to help alleviate this burden on defenders, we map to a defense in depth model, but we've got a low total cost of ownership, which helps, as you pointed out, John. It helps get more ROI into what you're already spending money on, which is something like an antivirus or an EDR platform, right? You can't really live without those platforms, but you can get more value out of those if you can increase your efficacy of prevention with Morphisec. So those are kind of the four areas that we really map to. I think what we're looking at today is, if I were to point out one single takeaway from this slide right here, that would be known versus unknowns, right? And this is a slide that we talk with customers about all the time, which is, look, you've got alternatives to antivirus, right? If we're just looking at a straight on categorization of different tools in the endpoint security market, there's alternatives, there's things that you can use that augment and sort of start to enhance antivirus. And this was sort of the genesis of how the EDR market started maybe 5 years ago at this point, 5 to 6 years ago. But the reality is being able to detect an attack after it's already executed and it's already started doing damage to your system isn't really all that valuable. And we've honed in on this very closely at Morphisec, and we've got 3 key things that we do, right? We are focused on preventing the unknown attacks that hit the memory, right? If you think about a fileless attack, it's going to the memory in some way, shape, or form at some point during the course of that attack lifecycle, right? And why are we so valuable in this use case? Well, because our agent runs, right? Our agent runs and is able to prevent the execution in a way that's not only just real time, but it doesn't take any manual help to do that, and it doesn't need any assistance, and it's not reliant, in your words, John, it's not reliant on a signature or some type of indicator in order to be effective. And I think that's a extremely valuable. It's an extremely valuable example of what we're doing. And here's actually an example. If you look at the window of exposure, right, that exists as a result of having different technologies in place around antivirus and around next-gen antivirus, the reality is, number one, you've got a delayed start of coverage already. You're already behind the 8 ball in terms of this attack lifecycle, right? Prevention without detection is what we're trying to get to with our technology. And that's the way that all of our customers are thinking as well too. Wow, if I could have something that's an advanced preventative control that I don't have to worry about, but B, the coverage starts from the moment that the malicious code is attempting to inject into a system. That is critical. And one thing that we actually always use is some data, actually, John, from one of your recent reports. I'll bring that up in a second. But if I were to point to one key piece of information and one piece of intelligence here, there's a difference between attacks and malware. And oftentimes, I think the market has it wrong in terms of an overwhelming focus on malware. Not every attack, or not, and also not every breach is inclusive of malware. And I think if you're looking at the way that we define attacks, attacks are targeted. Attacks are campaigns that are launched at an organization. And when 80% of those are happening at the endpoint, you know that there's a reason for that. There's a reason that attackers are headed there. There's data that's interacted with there. There are unsuspecting users. There's non-technical users who really aren't security conscious, who are more worried about how many times they're going to check Facebook throughout the day at work. How many emails they can pour through, and then certainly they're not focused on being security conscious in terms of their behavior at work. Wow, I shouldn't click on that link. Wow, I shouldn't open that email. I shouldn't even open that email because, boy, I don't really know the sender and it looks somewhat suspicious. I think what happens is employee error often adds up to really vulnerable circumstances within an organization. And the reason that's happening at the endpoint is the users. And back to what I was just referencing, John, here. So this is ESG research at its finest right here. You guys went out and asked folks in your latest endpoint security survey, would you rather have something that could prevent a larger volume of attacks and just prevent it? Or would you rather go out and use advanced detection and response tools, because to your point, that's where there is a lot of investment right now in the market? And 80% of the respondents came back and said, well, if I had to choose one or the other, I would choose an advanced preventative control, because I'd rather just prevent more, a larger volume of stuff that perhaps I can't really detect. And if there was a way to prevent it and then focus on a smaller collection of alerts, notifications, and investigative resources, I could probably get better there in that 20% than I can, and rely on something that I don't have to think about, that's just going to prevent on the front end. I don't know, John, if you have any thought there, but this is definitely the data coming out of the ESG camp.
Yeah, Tom, it's consistent with what I talked about before and that you've reinforced. And it's, number one, I can't do more if I don't have more people. It's doesn't make sense from a management standpoint to just keep giving your staff more to do, because at best they can do a poor job on a lot of things or a good job on a few things. And thinking that we'll just continue to give them more and more technologies to learn and to deploy and to operate just doesn't make sense. So this is really kind of logic at work, is if I can buy something that will be easy to use and will decrease the amount of work I need to do so that I can focus elsewhere, that's what I want to do. So it wasn't surprising to see this, but in the noise of the marketplace, one might not think of this as the logical out path.
Sure. No, thank you. And I'll get into a little more now about generally how we do what we do here in Morphisec. So I know that there's so many new tools that are coming out on the market. There's so many new detection mechanisms. There's so many ways to be able to look at new attacks today. And what I'm going to do is, as I built this out, is it really comes down to two things in terms of the innovation that Morphisec applies to the approach, which is moving target defense, right? What we do is we look at advantages and disadvantages throughout how we either defend our business or we get compromised. It's either one, right? I can either go out there and I can do what I've been doing in the past and cross my fingers and hope and pray that I'm not really going to be targeted too often. And I'll as a CISO, I will I'll make it another year. we look at it in a very through a very clear lens, which is like there's advantages and there's disadvantages, and there's advantages on the attacker's side, and there's advantages on the defender side, and we've been as defenders at a disadvantage fundamentally in cybersecurity. This is the way that we view the world, right? Because of one thing, we've been far too reactive in how we're detecting the threats that come in, right? And what happens is when you're not looking at innovating and you're consistently focused on doing things the way that you've done them in the past, things get predictable. And attackers know, they start to understand how certain technologies work. They start to understand how many defense-based technologies work, right? And in the past, right, organizations have been making themselves predictable by remaining static, by just trying to build up technologies and build up higher walls that attackers are eventually going to topple or just come right through, right? It's a static way to defend your business. What we've done with moving target defense is we've shifted that paradigm to becoming more unpredictable. If you can take what the attackers are after and you can move them, then you become, by virtue, more unpredictable, right? That's the notion behind moving target defense. And doing this in a proactive way makes you even more unpredictable, right? You become a moving target. You wouldn't go up against, if you were cornered on the street. I mean, to me, this is a great example. If you're cornered on the street by somebody, and you either have two choices: you can stay still and get hit, or you can move and not get hit. Running away isn't necessarily such a bad thing in a situation like that. You wouldn't stand still just to take damage. And I think that this is a great way to think about and just totally changing the mindset around what you're doing relative to defending your business. And this cool little slide here, I'm going to go ahead and build this out, talks a little bit about how moving target defense works. And I'm not going to get into the granularity of a major technical discussion here. But the reality is attackers, and as you know, John, attackers often try to ride processes that are acceptable processes to the operating system whenever they're trying to attack. And oftentimes that can be a simple process like opening up a PDF on your computer, right? And when these processes kick off within the application memory space, oftentimes attackers are looking to say, okay, well, guess what? I'm going to try to inject into this process. I'm not going to inject into the application, but I'm going to try to inject into this process that most likely is an acceptable process based on the IT rules and policies that are in place in this organization. Well, when they try to do that, that's where the Morphisec agent kicks in. And what it does is, number one, it morphs the application memory space. In other words, it takes it, scrambles it, and morphs it. And what it does is using an algorithm on the back end to basically take that space and move it so that an attacker can't necessarily attack it. In the meantime, what the technology does after that is it creates a skeletonized version of that application memory space. And what it's doing is it's showing that to the attacker. When it creates that skeleton, if you would, that is what the attacker sees. So there's an element of deception in what happens on the back end, but I don't want to get this confused with anything that's in the realm of the category of deception-based security. We are not deception-based security. We are able to show this shell of the application memory space as we morph and move the original application memory space, meaning that any injection into that skeletonized version means that is an attack with intent on the operating system, and that Morphisec has prevented that attack. What we do is we notify the administrator that we prevented that, right? We don't have to do anything else other than that in our preventative process. What we do also on the back end is we do collect a substantial amount of critical information and intelligence that's mostly pre-execution data that's very, very valuable for threat research beyond that preventative control. But we're totally focused on one thing at that point in time, which is preventing the execution of that attack. And I'd like to build out this one slide here. I know that we're starting to get toward the end of our time here, but this is something that I think is pretty interesting. So when we think about what we do for our customers, we have the unique ability to be able to prevent against some of the some of the most advanced attacks that are out there. And as I build this slide out, what I've done here is I've categorized all of the different types of attacks. And this isn't really an exhaustive list, and I clearly need to update it. But if you look at some of the most notable attacks of the past year to a year and a half, ransomware attacks like WannaCry and NotPetya, banking Trojan attacks that are entirely targeted at financial services systems, even uncategorized attacks that just are that are their own type of attack, like Pushto. I think that where we have an advantage on behalf of our customers is none of our customers were ever impacted by any of these attacks, and we take great pride in being able to say that to our customers. Customers weren't impacted by these attacks. Did they need to know about these attacks? Absolutely. But were they impacted, and were they subject to, if you think about something like a WannaCry or NotPetya, were they subject to that ransomware payload hitting? And the answer is no, they weren't. And this is a very, very interesting sort of discussion that we typically run into with our customers and partners, which is, we want to continue to add more value for our customers, but we are totally dedicated to one thing up front, our main capability, which is prevention. And I think this is a great example of at least just some of the malware that we've prevented over the past year and a half. In addition, we're highly focused on exploits as well too, and this is a smattering of some of the well-known fileless exploits that have been used in multiple targeted attacks globally that we've also prevented against. Why? Because again, we don't need prior knowledge of it, but also on the back end, we have a team of researchers who are consistently looking at the different types of exploits and malware that will be used and that can be used out in the wild. So we incorporate that into our technology. We incorporate that into how we build out further capability for our customers. So these are two interesting examples, I think, that help give us an advantage when we're talking to organizations who are considering or who are used to sort of the status quo pitch from other vendors in the market. It's very, very important. One great example of this is, and I'm only going to spend a few seconds here, is the CCleaner attack. We discovered this, right? And we discovered this on behalf of our VAS partner. And what we were able to do was that we were able to basically uncover that this was a supply chain attack, and we were able to take that. We were able to look at that binary. We were able to figure out exactly what that was based on the great threat research that our team does, right? And this has been acknowledged by a VAS. So basically, look, hey, thank you guys for doing this, because you definitely helped us, and you helped us avoid having a number of infected PCs by this legitimate attack. So we're not only are we a partner to our customers, but we're a research partner to a lot of our partners as well too. So this is definitely an interesting example, some of the notoriety and validation that Morphisec's had in the market. So we are about 3 minutes away. I'm going to get to one of our final case studies here in SR. I was just in India a couple of weeks ago, John, and I presented with Kier Desai, who is the CISO of SR, a large billion-dollar company in India. And we presented together, and one of the things that he said was, look, and it kind of points to all the trends that you've uncovered here for attendees today, which is when you have a lean security team, it doesn't mean that you have a security team that can't handle some of the advanced attacks. It means that you need the right tools in place to be able to prepare yourself to defend against advanced persistent threats, right? 0 days and fileless-based attacks. And one of the things that Kier presented was, said, look, there's a lot of tools out there, and they actually have a pretty substantial stack in terms of their protection stack, John. But what he said was, I needed something that could give me a little bit more peace of mind around the targeted attacks that I know are coming in. And that was what kind of, rang true for me, which was, I've got all these things in place, right? And I'm trying to protect 10,000 seats here. I want to make sure that I've got some coverage here that's a little bit different from the other technologies that I have in place. And there's Kier's quote. And if I were to sort of, summarize with one slide here, there's really two things that are coming together, right? There's two forces that are coming together that have sort of made Morphisec a critical protection layer for customers globally, right? And we're over 75 customers, and we will be announcing very shortly that we are deployed on over 2 million endpoints worldwide, which is a fantastic milestone for this company. But if I were to leave attendees today with one thing, it's the element of operational simplicity is starting to collide with the protection of advanced threats. And if you're looking at two things today, I think this is honestly where cybersecurity is headed. We've been far too reactive. We've been totally focused on rear view mirror security for a long time. And now we're moving to a more proactive state. And the proactivity really started with being able to monitor and to look at things from a behavioral and AI standpoint with some of the other technologies that are out there in most security stacks and most companies. But being able to proactively prevent is something that really hasn't been a focus of a lot of the organizations within cyber who have wanted to try to get better, right? I think every vendor out there, every technology vendor out there wants to get better at what they're doing for their customers. And the element of operational simplicity is colliding with protection, right? And this is why at Morphisec, we sell to the security group as much as we sell to the IT group. And for me personally, I've been in cyber for a long time. It's the first time that I've ever seen a technology that's been able to kind of bridge that gap between IT, OT, and security. So if I were to leave you with one idea, these are the two forces that are at work that are really starting to fuel the acceleration and the ramp of technology from Morphisec that's starting to really catch fire out there in the market. So I'll leave this slide up, but John, what are your thoughts on, as we start to wrap up here, operationally speaking, and then from a security standpoint, are you seeing that there's kind of a new wave of not just technology, but a new wave of thinking about how you're really going to defend your business and what it's really going to take to do that?
Yes, I like I said, Tom, I think historically more was better, and now people have to take a much more prudent and logical approach to security, understanding that they can't do everything, and understanding that there are some walls we can put up effectively that we couldn't put up in the past. And I think, as we call it, advanced prevention technology. As you described Morphisec, it really does fit the model.
Awesome. Well, John, I want to say thank you very much for joining us today. I think anytime anybody can listen to any of your presentations, read your blogs, read the research that's coming out of ESG between you and the rest of the security group. I would encourage anybody to absolutely look to John as a pioneer in innovative thinking around cybersecurity. So, honestly, thank you very much for joining us today, John. We really, really appreciate your time.
My pleasure, Tom.
All right. That concludes our webinar today, everybody. We'll be happy to answer any questions. We'll go into the chat queue. Certainly, you can contact us at any point. You can probably the easiest way today would be marketing@morphisec.com, morphisec.com. We'll be happy to answer any of your questions, give you a demo of our technology, give you some of our thinking, let you try it out, etc. So we'd be happy to hear from you. And again, this concludes the webinar today. We look forward to talking to you very soon. Thank you very much, everybody, for attending.